Excuse me.
The society eroded and voluntarily overthrew the democracy. And that is the big fear. And so he argued in Federalist 10 that we've set up a system that makes it difficult for any one faction to control all the levers of power. By dividing power up into as many pieces as possible, federal, state, the three branches, we divide the legislature into two branches. By chopping power up into all these pieces, we make it difficult, and Madison hoped impossible, for any one group to seize enough power to destroy our democracy.
You cowards! You traitors! You traitors!
Welcome, Dr. Dilley. Thank you for coming in to answer some questions for us today.
I'm Dr. Brian Dilley. I teach political science here at Mesa Community College. I have taught here for 22 years.
In 2018, Pew Research Center did a study on Americans where they told 5 facts and 5 opinions and asked them to differentiate between fact and opinion. The results were that Americans on average get 3/5 correct, which is slightly better than the random guessing. Do you believe journalists and media outlets have a duty to provide the truth to people and properly differentiate between fact and opinion?
Yeah, well, my first reaction is I'm surprised it's that high, that it's 3 out of 5 and not 2 out of 5, because particularly with no context clues, it's easy to trick people into thinking something's true when it's not, which gets to your question, what is the responsibility of the media on this? And the answer is yes, the responsibility does have a duty to present truth and opinion as opinion. It's okay to present both, but they should be clear about which is which. One of the problems with media today is we live in an age of infotainment. So the fact and opinion are intermingled in a way that you can't tease it out. The purpose of that entertainment is to draw an audience. It's always good to remember when we're talking about the broadcast media that there are two overriding objectives that color what you see, and one of them is profit. They have to attract a large market, so they're not going to say things that drive people away, and they are going to say things that keep people coming back. The other one is deadlines, that they're in a hurry, and so they make mistakes. And so if you keep those things in mind, it'll help navigate the media sphere. But they do have a responsibility, and the best outlets take that responsibility seriously, and lots of outlets don't. So as a consumer, you need to figure out who takes it seriously or not.
Should there be limits on what we are free to say?
There are no absolute rights. Every right we have has limits. Only zealots argue for absolute rights, and they're usually wrong. Every right we have has limits. So with speech, the limit is typically, as far as broadcast media, it's typically protecting individuals. So you can't take a private person and slander them in public. If it's a public person, they're sort of fair game because they put themselves out there. But a private individual is protected from the kind of slander or libel, particularly on a national scale. And then the other thing are things like national security or ongoing investigations or things like that. And so there are limits to speech, both by the media and even you as an individual. There are limits to what you can say. And we spend a lot of time arguing about where those limits are, but the fact that there is a limit is not something we need to argue about. There are no absolute rights.
Politically speaking, what is the difference between the right and the left, and why are they being promoted as opposing factions?
So I'm not a big fan of the sort of right-left dichotomy because real people don't fit neatly in either one of those boxes. But to answer your question, the right tends to be more conservative, which means traditionally they're more in favor of tradition. And protecting the community from harm. The left tends to be more liberal in the sense that they want maximum freedom, they want justice, that the society should care for the weak and the helpless, and that government is a viable solution to care for the weak and the helpless. And so, whereas conservatives tend to see the government as doing more harm than good when it tries to help. And so they tend to minimize governmental interventions. So in the American political spectrum, we all sort of value freedom, and we all value equality, and we all value order. But when those values are in conflict, that's when you tease out right versus left. Some people value freedom more than order. Some people value equality more than freedom. But we share these values, but we don't share them all in equal measure. And that's how we sort ourselves out. One way to guarantee a market share, particularly for the broadcast media, is to make your audience angry or afraid. Because when you're angry or afraid, it keys in all sorts of emotions and body chemicals that are addictive. You get an adrenaline rush when you are made to feel superior to people. Your adrenaline kicks in when you become scared of some people. And people, when they feel those things, they want to come back for a daily hit to feel that again. And so when I'm telling my students on their media outlets that if you're listening to like talk radio, for example, if you're not angry at the end of the program, they haven't done their job because that is their entire business plan, is to make their audience angry or afraid. And so the right and left both do that in their sort of designated media. They just pick different things to make you afraid of or make you feel better about. But it's all profit motive. When you look at the history, it's kind of funny because the founding fathers, pretty much all of them said that parties were a bad idea because they fostered faction. That whole, making people angry or afraid, that's good for the party, not particularly good for the country. And so the founders really worried about that. But yet the founders are the ones who formed the parties, right? So political parties have been with us from the very beginning of the Republic because there's just no better way to win elections, particularly to keep all your people who are excited about you. How do you keep them in one place in between elections? Parties allow for that. And so groups that were able to keep their supporters organized win elections. Groups that are like, hey, the election's over, everyone go home, see you in 4 years, those people don't win elections. And so even though the founding fathers all complained and worried about parties, they all immediately went out and organized political parties. And so that has been the case. Our entire country's history has been partisan. What has changed now is there is, and I think this is driven by the media narrative, the volume has increased. And so people have always been annoyed at the other party. But as I said, it's harder to escape. And there's less motive to go across party lines and listen to the other side. Where previous generations, the volume was lower, so you could do more of that.
Do you believe political rhetoric along party lines affects base morals of people in the U.S. fundamentally changing how they think?
That's a tricky question because rhetoric does have an impact. Words matter. The question of does it affect morality, though, is a fairly deep debate of can the media, through rhetoric, change your worldview and shift your morality? Or is it the case that the media reflects those values and we sort of select which media we want to listen to based on those values? And so I've always taught, when I'm doing the chapter on media, I always teach that the media tells us what to think about, but they don't tell us what to think, because our values and opinions are more deep-seated than that. However, they definitely set the agenda. what are we arguing about? That is driven by the media. So it's a complicated question, and again, the new thing is the current media, the volume is much higher, and so maybe the old data where the media doesn't change people's base morality, maybe that's no longer valid in today's world, but I don't know. It's a good question.
If rhetoric on large enough platform can change fundamental beliefs on Americans, should there be limits on how much and what kind of rhetoric is used by politicians?
Well, it gets to the premise of the question. So the question is premised on the idea that if social media can actually change opinion or give people opinions they didn't already have, then absolutely, right? That's I don't know about regulated, but at least it needs to be paid attention to. If on the other hand, the social media is, again, reflecting people's existing values, then that regulation would not seem to be called for, because people are self-selecting which social media sites they're going to. The algorithms are driving it. It's a real problem that people have bubbles. Is it the government's responsibility to pop those bubbles? I don't know.
What role do social media companies play in regards to freedom of speech, and would they make any changes?
Well, they play a huge role because social media is currently a dominant platform for people to express themselves. Whether or not the government should be involved in that, though, is a tricky question because they are private entities. It's like if I own a building and I've got the side of a building, do I have the right to say who gets to post posters on the side of my building? Well, you could argue no, because the public walks by, they get to see your building. Anyone should be able to post anything on the building. But on the other hand, like, it's my building, right? If I've got someone wants to post something that I think is dangerous or false or just I don't approve of, it's my building. I should have the right to tear the poster down and invite people who I do like to put posters on. So social media, it's a super complicated question because they're not utilities. They're services that people choose to participate in. And so the same sort of speech protections that might be in place for a private individual or a news organization are not in place for someone who's posting on Facebook or Twitter. If they violate the guidelines that the company has set, they have no right to demand that their post will be maintained because it's a private company. They get to decide what those limits are. So the First Amendment doesn't apply at all to social media because First Amendment limits government behavior. It doesn't limit private behavior.
Do you think freedom of the press is overprotected in the Constitution in regards to people with the need to prove actual malice when the press oversteps and defames an innocent individual?
I think our country's history shows that government officials, given the ability to silence their critics, they will. And so we absolutely need to protect the ability of the press to criticize those in power. That means we have to tolerate a lot of silliness, but that is the price that you have to pay if you want to have accountable government. So I would say the protections are essential, not too much.
Do you feel as if freedom of speech is being taken away from us?
I do not think the freedom of speech has been taken away. The threat of that is being used by the right in particular, but occasionally the left, but mainly it's the right now, where they're saying our freedom of speech is being taken away when what's ironic is they're using their freedom of speech to complain about their freedom of speech being taken away. On the platforms that they have public access to, they're complaining that their freedom of speech is being taken away. It doesn't make any sense. Their freedom of speech is not in fact being taken away. But if your opinions are not popular and they're not connecting to the majority, then you can complain about your freedom of speech being taken away. That's not what's going on. What's going on is it's a terrible idea and the public is rejecting it. And again, the freedom of speech applies to the government restricting your speech. It does not apply to a private sector not allowing you to use their platform. You don't, that's a right you don't have, to force someone else to carry your words.
Should the same protections that the press receives online be applied to what is said by an individual on a social platform?
Well, yes, but at the same time, the same restrictions should apply as well. So that if an individual uses a platform to slander someone, then they should be held accountable for that slander. If someone makes a threat to do violence to someone on social media, they should receive the same attention and punishment as someone who made that threat off of social media. So I don't think the platform matters so much as the Speech Act itself. And I don't think a social media should have a special set of rules that other types of media don't have.
With the current political landscape, divided parties, and growing inequalities between the elite and working class, do you see America lasting 1,000 years or suffering a similar fate to the Roman Empire?
Boy, isn't that the core question of the day. So I remember during the Bush administration back in the early 2000s, I spent 8 years telling my liberal friends, don't worry, the Republic will survive. And then during 8 years of the Obama administration, I spent 8 years telling my conservative friends, don't worry, the Republic will survive. The last 4 years, I wasn't entirely sure what to tell them because the threats that the Republic are facing now are from within. If you go back to Madison and Federalist Number 10, he talked about why would the American experiment succeed? And he looked all throughout history, and every democracy prior to the American experiment had failed. And so he looked at why did it fail? And what he concluded was it was factionalization. It wasn't that they got taken over, invaded. It wasn't that they all just decided kings are better. It's because factions within the society eroded and voluntarily overthrew the democracy. And that is the big fear. And so he argued in Federalist 10 that we've set up a system that makes it difficult for any one faction to control all the levers of power. And by dividing power up into as many pieces as possible, federal, state, the three branches, we divide the legislature into two branches. By chopping power up into all these pieces, we make it difficult, and Madison hoped impossible, for any one group to seize enough power to destroy our democracy. And I think there's a genius in that design. And so I think the Republic will survive, but it will only work if the institutions that were set up by Madison and the founders are allowed to operate. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is a concerted effort to destroy or minimize the ability of those institutions to function properly. And that's very dangerous because we need all those checks in place. So there's a reason we don't want the vice president, for example, to have the authority to overthrow a democracy, because that's part of the checks and balances, is to prevent one person from keeping themselves in power regardless of what the people say. And so it's dangerous to even talk about diminishing those checks and balances, let alone taking active steps to diminish them. So having said all of that, I am an optimist at heart. If you look throughout our history, we talked about the Civil War, we talked about partisanship that's been really, vile and strong in the past. America has lots of problems right now. But if you look at all those problems, any one of them has a worse version of it in our history, whether it's inequality or lack of social justice or partisanship or threats to elections, right? We've dealt with all of these things before in worse forms. And each of those times we came out ahead. And so the source of my optimism is that Americans are great muddlers, meaning despite our greed, despite our incompetence, despite our stupidity, we always manage to muddle our way through. And we always come out of a crisis stronger than we went into it, because we're just really good at muddling our way through, despite all the things arrayed against us. And so I have great optimism in Americans and our ability to muddle our way through. And so I think that is what we're still doing now. And so I remain optimistic. Whether it can last 1,000 years, I don't know, that's a long time. But I think we will last the next 3.
Why do people feel like they need to deceive others to benefit themselves?
Well, that goes straight to the human condition, doesn't it? Why do people deceive others to benefit themselves? Again, I'm an optimist and I teach diplomacy. And so what I try to teach people is that when you behave that way, when you harm others in order to benefit yourself, the reason you do that is because there is a short-term benefit. Right? And then there is a benefit. These things wouldn't happen if they weren't beneficial to someone for doing it. But in the act of doing that, it undermines your credibility, and it undermines your ability to engage in long-term collective action, because no one trusts you. So you can get away with that as long as you're strong. But the moment the balance of power shifts and you are no longer strong, everything you've done will be undone, because everyone else didn't buy into it because you used coercion or deceit to get it. And so if you want to have long-term lasting impact, and even from a selfish point of view, long-term lasting gain, that only comes through persuasion, not coercion, because then people will voluntarily do what you want them to do, which means they will continue doing it even when they have more power than you do. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's again, the basis of my optimism and my counsel is people do that, but they always get it in the end. It comes back and gets them. So here's one more thing. Pessimists never create. Pessimists don't create, because what's the point? If the murderous thugs are secretly in charge, like, why would you bother voting? Right? So conspiracy theories and cynicism and pessimism never solve the problem. Optimists are the ones who roll up their sleeves and get stuff done. And if you take a historical approach, almost every issue is better today than it was 30 years ago. So when I was going to college, the world had lots of problems. You're now in college, the world has lots of problems, but they're different problems. And if you look at the problems that my generation was facing with, almost all of them were better off now than we were then. And that positive change did not happen through wishful thinking. It happened because people rolled up their sleeves and they got to work and they made it better. And so that's my pitch is don't retreat to cynicism, despite all the bad things going on. Cling on to that optimism and actually jump in and do something about it.
Okay, Dr. Dilley, thank you so much for answering our questions and coming in today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, good luck with your project. It's important. As I said, words matter. And so it's good to study rhetoric.